interest rates will rise in a way that will choke off growth.
Let's look at what's moving the interest rates, day by day, week by week. You can see what's happening. So last week, interest rates, long-term interest rates rose at the end of the week. What was driving that? Quite clearly, there were a couple of economic reports that came in that seemed more favorable than people expected. They were the Philadelphia manufacturing survey, a couple other things came in more favorable. People got more optimistic. Now, if it was about deficits, interest rates should have gone down, because if the economy is going to be stronger, we're going to have more revenue, the deficits are not going to be as big as we thought. Instead, they went up. So what was actually driving it? Well, people were thinking that the Fed is likely to come off its zero interest rate policy sooner. So those rising interest rates were not about fear of deficits, they were about optimism about the economy. This week, interest rates came down. What was driving that? Well, there was some bad news about the economy. Several surveys, several other pieces of information came in weaker than expected. Again, if you really thought it was about deficits, the interest rates should have gone up, because the deficit's going to be bigger if the economy doesn't recover.
And presumably your argument, which I'm now just going to state because I've read you saying it, is that interest rates were abnormally low, that what they're now returning to, so to regard it as a rise is unfair. They're returning to kind of normal levels, and that the interest rates of a month ago were pricing in the end of the world, and that scenario is
also
gone
a
away.
weak economy, interest rates low.
But isn't it fair to say that interest rates where they are they're not a danger to growth right now? They're still very low.
We've seen some signs of interest rates increasing to some extent because of people talking about the debt increasing. There's no question. You can look at some time. That's what I look over this period of time. More and more concerned about the debt. Look at the public opinion polls. People are talking about the debt. Those are the people who are doing the investing.
All right. What is this?
I think there's no question that the interest rates will increase if we continue to borrow some. We have to now, just one more thing. We have to send our Secretary of State and Secretary of Treasury to China to tell them to buy our debt. That's the kind of thing we're going through.
Except the reality is we're borrowing only about half as much from China as we were before the crisis. I mean, the fact of the matter is we've had this collapse of private borrowing, total collapse of private borrowing. Net borrowing by the private sector is now negative. So the public sector has moved in, it's doing a lot of borrowing, but overall, in a way, you say, well, the Japanese were able to finance this out of their own savings. So are we. In fact, we're not. If you look at the changes, all of the increase in government.
Explain why we are now not selling as much debt to the Chinese.
Because families, households who had a zero savings rate before the crisis have suddenly discovered the need to save, and are up to something like 6% now. Because
and
corporations
that means they're buying government debt.
Well, or at least they're putting their money in the banks, and the banks are putting their money, depositing at the Fed, and there it goes. Corporations are not borrowing for investment because they've got the lowest capacity utilization on record. They're not building stuff, so they don't want to borrow. They need to borrow. People are not building houses, which means that they're not borrowing to buy houses, which means that all of these ways in which the private sector was borrowing have gone down. The private sector is saving much more than it did before. The government has stepped in, is doing a lot of borrowing. In a way, that's the whole point of fiscal stimulus, is that the government will do the spending and borrowing that the private sector will not. And our actual dependence on foreign investors to buy our bonds is way down. If you ask who's paying for this, it's not the Chinese, it's us.
All right.
They're not buying our debt. That's one of the problems. That's why they're over there saying to buy more.
We've got to talk about one thing we are certainly going to have to pay for, which is healthcare reform. You don't like the Obama plan, I take it.
Well, related to the deficit, of course, it's going to cost a lot. CBO has estimated 1 trillion, 1.6 trillion, depending on the plan. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things that need to be looked at just on the relating to our previous conversation about spending. And there's some efforts to try to contain it, but right now I don't see that. I think a plan has to come out here which doesn't just mean more and more spending without find a way to keep costs down.
Paul, Robert Samuelson, Washington Post Newsweek columnist, sober guy, says of Obama's healthcare reform, it is naive, hypocritical, and simply dishonest. And it's basically his argument is that it pushes off all the hard decisions about costs and things like that. But you like it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm concerned that he's going to not do enough about universality, not enough about costs. So we need to see. But look, few things we know. Some of the things that are most controversial are actually cost-saving measures. If we're going to have a public option, a strong public option, that's almost certainly going to reduce costs. That's one of the things that will actually make it cheaper.
Why?
Because the public option, first of all, it will discipline the insurance companies. A lot of places there's no effective competition in the insurance market. When I see Senator Grassley talking about free market competition, I take a look at the AMA's figures and say that, gee, one insurance company has 71% of the market in his state, right? So more competition, be a plan that operates with much lower marketing, administrative, overhead costs. And
why will a government plan have lower marketing?
Oh, this is one of the things we know, that in this case, the private sector is bureaucratic and has huge administrative costs, and the public sector does not. Private insurance companies spend 14% of their revenues on administration. Medicare spends 3%. And that's because, fundamentally, it's because private insurance companies spend a lot of money trying to figure out who really needs health insurance so as not to give it to them. All the evidence suggests that more government intervention is actually going to reduce costs, not raise them.
I don't see how you can think government is going to do a better job of
But it does.
operating healthcare in this
But
particular
it
market.
does. Medicare is more efficient than private insurance.
Completely different market. Also, in terms of
But does
competition,
the consumer have any ability to really have knowledge, have power to exercise, to bring costs down? I mean, at least in healthcare, he hasn't over the last 30 years.
well, it doesn't have an incentive issue in terms of giving the consumers more incentive. That's one of why I think these policies or proposals to actually transfer some money. Remember, John McCain had a proposal where you'd have a credit for people to buy
but I just
insurance.
think about this personally. If my doctor told me to take 3 tests, am I really in a position to say to him, well, actually, the statistical data suggests that I don't need the 2nd and 3rd test? I mean, you're going to do what your doctor tells you to do, right? And
if you can afford it, if you have the most expensive health insurance in the world, sure you can, but most people don't, and so we have to figure a way to find the best health care.
There are large numbers of Americans who either don't have health insurance or who, when push comes to shove, when emergencies happen, discover that the insurance they have, which they might have been happy with until it was tested, turns out to be inadequate. And advanced countries don't do this to their citizens, right? There is no reason why we should not have a guarantee of essential health care for every American.
we're going to have to leave it at that. I will leave it to the viewers to decide who won.